Okay. You're gonna have to hit the Charlotte, you're gonna have to hit the OK button on
gotcha.
the other one there.
And the other one, okay.
Otherwise,
Brian.
Brian can do it. Otherwise, Brian can be able to see it. Okay. Shabbat Shalom. So I promise you that this was not a setup, but when I was introducing the Torah reading, and I mentioned Korach's question, and Brian said, they are all holy, right? And of course, Brian being a Levi and Korach being a Levi and his gang being Levi'im. And at some point, Moses says to them, you know, Rav Lachem b'nei Levi. Okay, you Levites have gone too far, right? But I have to say the following. A number of years ago, there was a provocative article in Conservative Judaism. Unfortunately, the journal no longer exists, but it was a scholarly journal of Conservative Judaism. And the article was called Korach's Question Deserves an Answer, right? What is Korach's question? Why do you set yourself above the Lord's congregation? All the people are holy, right? And Moses never really directly answers the question, right? And if Moses doesn't answer it, so then, you know, if we're good rabbinic Jews, where we're going to look for an answer? And the answer is the Midrash, right? But the Midrash doesn't really answer the question either, right? I mean, we see this, and we're seeing this now, right? With Cassidy Hutchinson, if you can't actually disprove the claim that was made, so you try to discredit the witness, right? And so if you look at the Midrash, they don't answer the question. What they try to do is make Korach look ridiculous, okay? The last thing in the previous parsha was the commandment for tzitzit, right? And in the commandment for tzitzit, it says that there should be a thread of techelet, of blue, right? A particular thread of blue. So according to the Midrash, Korach goes and he says to Moses, what if the whole talit is blue? Does it still need a blue thread, right? And Moses says, yes, it does. And of course, oh, ridiculous, right? The whole garment is blue, and that's not enough to make it holy, but the one little thread, it does, right? And then he goes, and this is really anachronistic, he says, what if you have a whole room full of Torah books? Does it still need a mezuzah, right? And Moses says, yeah, it does. And again, he says, oh, you know, the whole room is full of sacred books, and that's not good enough, but this one little scroll, that makes it okay, right? So the question that I want to ask is, why does the Midrash go to such length to discredit Korach? Why? Right. Easier than answering the question. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Alan.
We see this now in contemporary events. It's one thing if somebody has the idea to help the organization to be constructive. It's far different if somebody seeking self-aggrandizement and is trying to discredit that person's own purpose. And to an extent, and to the extent that I believe it makes sense, the Korach legend makes sense. That's it. If he wasn't a man of good faith, albeit that he was learned, albeit that he made some good points, that's the danger of rabble.
Right, okay, anybody else?
Wait, Rabbi,
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else on Zoom feels the same way, but could you kind of summarize what Alan said? I couldn't understand it.
Okay, so Alan, if I may paraphrase, and if I get it wrong, you'll correct me, right? Is that Korach may have made some good points, but he wasn't acting in good faith. He was really seeking self-aggrandizement and not the good of the, well, Alan said organization, meaning in this case, you know, the Israelite people. And that is the danger of a rabble rouse, right? And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, the most successful lie is going to have an element of truth, right? In it, if it, you know, I mean, people make fun of like Jewish space lasers and Italian satellites changing votes and whatever. But if there's you know 10% of truth in the lie becomes more credible, right? And I think that, I mean, all of you are exactly correct, all right? You can't answer the question because Korach is actually right. The substance of his, or at least partially right? It's not, I mean, he's got two complaints, right? He says, Moses and Aaron, you've given yourself too much power because all the people is holy, right? And the second part of his question or statement is absolutely correct, right? All of the people are holy, right? And the problem is not so much the substance of the question as the demagoguery behind it, right? And there's a fine line between a populist and a demagogue, as much of our own history will again. We have, you know, people who start out really as legit populists, but it goes to their head. I mean, you know, Willie Long, the perfect example, right? I mean, probably the beginning of his career, he probably was sincere, but as his career went on, he sought more power and more self-aggrandizement, right? And this demagoguery is further demonstrated by Korach questioning the whole enterprise. He says, you brought us up out of Egypt, get this, a land flowing with milk and honey, right? So it's not just Moses and Aaron's arrogance or alleged arrogance, which is called into question, but the whole project. Now, as I mentioned before, in the Parsha, God's ratification of Moses and Aaron's leadership is demonstrated quite publicly, right? The earth opens up and swallows Korah and his followers. And then after that, Aaron and the rival would-be priests set up staves in the tent of meeting, but only Aaron's sprouts and blossoms. And then the uprising is still not quelled, and an epidemic breaks out, kills 14,000 Israelites, and is stopped by Moses and Aaron's prayer, right? But the question remains, if all the people are holy, why single out certain people, right? If all the people are holy, why single out certain people, right? And here's the thing, right? To some extent, we've moved away from that model, right? Judaism has moved away from the priestly model, right? And we've also, at least in liberal or progressive forms of Judaism, moved away from the gender model, right? I mean, I was talking to Gail and Charlotte yesterday, right? And the overwhelming majority of our synagogue's new executive committee are females, right? And there is no issue in terms of, you know, male or female leadership in our congregation, right? I mean, we had a Hazan, female Hazan, who's entering her 20th year of serving our congregation, right? So we have moved away from leadership by birth, and we have moved away from leadership by gender, right? Religious leadership is open to anyone who is willing to take the time and put in the effort to learn. And administrative leadership also, if you're willing to put in the time and do the work and learn what has to be done, mazel tov, right? Or condolences, right? You're now a leader, right? And my teacher, Professor Jacob Pedachowski, called this the ever-expanding holiness franchise, right? That in Judaism, the realm of who is able to access the holy, who is able to access leadership, expands and expands and expands, right? And Pedachowski, interestingly enough, he was very much on the traditional end of the spectrum, and one would have imagined that he would have been ambivalent about women rabbis, but he wasn't, because he said it's in keeping with the ever-expanding holiness franchise, okay? And at the time, I know for a fact he was more than or less than ambivalent about LGBT rabbis, but I suspect if he were still alive, he would have come to acclimate himself to that fact as well on the same theory, right? But at the same time, that access to leadership is available to anybody who's willing to put in the work and put in the learning, Jewish law is not really democratic, right? I mean, the congregation is not at liberty to decide matters of halacha, right? Or to change certain normative steps. And this was demonstrated this morning, okay? I have had numerous discussions with some of you about why, if 10 people between the shul and Zoom can make up a minyan for anything else, why not for Torah reading, okay? And I suspect if we simply took a vote of the board, or maybe even of the ritual committee, I would lose the vote, okay? But guess what? Y'all don't get to vote. Just not, you can vote if I'm still the rabbi, but as long as I'm still the rabbi, right, that's a decision that I make. It's not democratic, okay? And since none of you have the power, I hope, to open the earth up and have it swallow me to demonstrate that I'm wrong, it would be nice if we had 10 people in person so that we could read the Torah, right? But the fact that it's not democratic goes against our grain as Americans, right? We want to vote. Majority rules, right? But the key in the case of Korach is Moses' humility. He's accused of setting himself over the people, but we were told last week that he was Anav Mikol Adav, the most humble person on the face of the earth, right? And we see that with leadership, right? I mean, I look at almost everybody here is a leader in one way or the other, right? And I have yet to hear somebody say, oh yes, I want to be an officer of the shul because of the power, right? And I want to be an officer of the shul because of the honor and the glory, right? Right? You do it because it needs to be done, right? And you're committed to the organization, and you're committed to Judaism, and you're committed to what we stand for, so you step up, okay? And that's why Moses did what he did. Now, towards the end of the Torah, we read about Moses inaugurating Joshua as the next leader, okay? And Moses is commanded by God to do two different acts when he inaugurates Joshua. It says, lay your hand on him, and then it says, give him some of your splendor, right? Now, how does laying hands differ from giving some of your splendor, right? Midrash Rabbah says, right, lay your hand on him. This is like lighting one candle from another. Give him some of your splendor. This is like pouring from one vessel to another, okay? Now, what the heck does that mean? Okay, what's the difference between lighting one candle from another and pouring from one vessel to another? Yeah.
Candle is still lit. You light it, not lit.
Right.
Pouring out, you're empty.
Right. Okay, so when you light a candle, right, the first candle is still lit. Right, you pour from one vessel to another. In other words, you light a candle from another. First candle is not diminished, right? You pour into one vessel from another. The first vessel is diminished. Okay, this is true. So what? So what? What's the practical difference, right? What's it we say in Gemara? So what's the nafka?
Splendor continues.
What? Go ahead. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that's the difference between influence and authority, right? If you share your influence is not diminished. If you share your authority is diminished, right? And Moses was happy for there to be plenty of influence, but he felt that there needed to be a monopoly on authority, right? And then Rabbi Sachs goes on to paraphrase Shakespeare. The influence we have lives after us. The power is oft interred with our bones, right? Much of Judaism is an extended essay on the supremacy of prophets over kings, right over might, teaching rather than coercion, influence in place of power, right? And if you look at the story of the Jewish people, right, we are tremendously influential in world history, right? Not so powerful, right? And Rabbi Sachs says the use of power diminishes others, the exercise of influence enlarges them, right? And we have been influential, we have been mostly powerless, okay? And here's where I get into the prognostication game, okay? I think we are about to see in this country the difference between power and influence, right? As the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, frankly, declines and declines and declines, right? You can exercise raw power, right? You can exercise raw power, and if you have an army behind you, you can force people to do what you say. You cannot force people to respect you. You can force people to obey you. You can't force people to respect you, right? And precisely because the Supreme Court, in terms of raw power, is in fact the least powerful branch of government, will their decisions be respected when they are seen to be lacking in legitimacy and simply an exercise in raw power? And I personally don't come to this conclusion lightly. I mean, you know, Kelly can tell you for the last several years, you know, at every decision that she's been outraged on, I said, look, the job of the Supreme Court is not to decide what's good or smart. It's to decide what's legal, right? And in many cases, I mean, they've made decisions that I thought were neither good or smart, but they were legitimate interpretations of the law, right? When they start to stray from legitimate interpretations of the law to very forced readings of the law that seem to be simply to get to the desired result, I mean, that's what conservative rabbis do. It's not what judges are supposed to do, right? And you know, Rabbi Sachs's point about the difference between power and influence, I think, is really very, very well taken. And like he said, I mean, I want to re-quote it because I think it's maybe should be inscribed over the lintel of the Supreme Court along with equal justice under law. The use of power diminishes others. The exercise of influence enlarges them. That is one of Judaism's most humanizing truths. Not all of us have power, but we are all capable of being an influence for good. Shalom.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I have a question. Could you explain the statement that you made, the least, I don't want to incorrectly quote you, but I think was like the least powerful branch of government. I understand the divisions of power and I understand the functions of each, but I'm very curious of the statement you just made in light of the impact of the result of the decisions that they've done.
Right, that's very legitimate. What I mean is literally raw power. The Supreme Court has, you know, a protective force of a couple dozen people. Supreme Court doesn't have an army, doesn't have a National Guard, doesn't have a police force, right? I mean, at a certain point, some governor somewhere is going to say they made a ruling, let them enforce it, right? Just like just like, you know, Mussolini is reputed to have said, how many divisions does the Pope have? Right? How many soldiers, how many policemen does the Supreme Court have? That's what I mean.
I understand your answer. I guess I'm looking at it so literally, but in my lifetime, it seems to have been one of the most powerful of actions in the history of our government.
Oh, absolutely, but my point is that we have learned over the last several years that our rules are not self-enforcing, right? And our institutions are not self-protecting, right? Ultimately, in the same way, right? Why do traffic lights work? Right? Traffic lights work because the vast majority of people see a red light and they stop, right? The minute 25–30% of the country starts looking at traffic lights as suggestions, right? That's it. We're done.
Okay.
Right? I mean, right? And ultimately, the other branches of government follow the rulings of the Supreme Court essentially voluntarily. Right? Because they believe in the legitimacy and credibility of the institution. If they stop believing in the legitimacy and credibility of the institution, we'll see. I mean, we saw this in 1861, right? And believe me, I'm not advocating anything. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just pointing out possible directions in which things may ultimately move, right? Like I asked last week rather, does anybody really believe that a national ban on abortion is going to be enforceable in Maryland? It's not, right? I don't care what the Supreme Court rules, right? It's not going to be enforceable in this country, in this state. It's just not going to happen, thank God. But it's not, Congress, and that's not the Supreme Court. I mean, ultimately, Congress can pass whatever they pass, right? But try and enforce it in places where the local government declines to enforce it, right? Ultimately, I guess what I'm saying is that enforcement of laws in this country rely as much on influence as they do on authority. That's really what I'm saying, right? Essentially, it's voluntary, right? We don't think of it that way, right? But, don't pay your taxes. Chances are you're probably not going to get caught, right? Realistically, right? I mean, the rule of law in this country depends as much on influence as it does on authority. And if the influence goes away, we're off to SARS, I think. So I really thank you for your question because it forced me to sharpen and clarify my own thinking. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
So we will not say the Kaddish before Musaf because that's connected to the Torah service, which we did not have.